Hey everyone, in today's show, I'm going to discuss the Americans with Disabilities Act and specifically some best practices in handling issues when employees are requesting unreasonable accommodations. Of course, every employer wants to treat people fairly and comply with the law. However, there are times that employees may be gaming the system and fabricating a disability just to get an accommodation.
Welcome to the HR Investigations podcast, exploring the issues, challenges, strategies, and solutions. Sponsored by RPCHR and hosted by Natalie Ivey, an HR consultant, licensed PI, and author of the best-selling book, How to Conduct Internal Investigations, a practical guide for human resource professionals. And now, here's Natalie.
Hey everyone, welcome to today's show. I am really excited about today's episode because I'm going to discuss an important topic, the ADA, accommodation issues, and I'm going to get into some best practices on how to minimize employer liability. So let's dig in and get started. When conducting an investigation into a possible ADA issue, it usually starts out with an employee alleging that the employer is discriminating against them because of a disability, and a lot of times it's because the employee requested an accommodation, but maybe the employer pushed back and stated that it was unreasonable. Well, sometimes the requests that come in as accommodation requests are a little questionable. I had one in my own business, and for those of you who are just tuning in, I run a company called RPC Human Resources, and we're in the Central Florida area. We've been around 22 years, and we handle all kinds of HR issues, and we're also an investigations agency. So what often happens is employees will sort of want special situations like remote work. We saw a lot of that coming out of the pandemic. Interesting how many disabilities suddenly were on the table when that was never brought up before, but it was only when the employer was asking them to come back to work, and suddenly now there's an autoimmune disorder and they are required to work from home and can't commute. Oh, interesting. Okay, so we have some of that. I had a case involving an employee in hospitality that could not get along with 2 out of the 3 supervisors that she worked with. And she had a counselor write a note stating that she just needed an accommodation to just not work with 2 of the 3 managers. Okay, that kind of stuff. Look, the ADA is designed to provide individuals with disabilities with, if you will, a level playing field. So they enjoy the same privileges and benefits as everyone else. And when they may have some challenges because of their disability in doing the job, the employer is responsible for granting reasonable accommodations. But what's happening is a lot of these things that are cropping up are really just pretty darned unreasonable. All right, so in order to determine if there is merit to an employee's claim, the first step an employer needs to take is just go to the job description. So best practice number 1 here, well-written, clearly defined essential job functions on the job description. And you need to have a job description for each of the positions at your place of business. All right, so if you look at your job description, does it really define essential job functions, or also what is known as Bona Fide Occupational Qualifications, BFOQs? Now, for those of you who may not be familiar with what these are, I like to call them the non-negotiable work tasks that an employee must perform. So as an example, if you have an employee, let's call him Randy, and Randy's a ramp agent for, well, let's say United Airlines or American Airlines. As you know, they have to load and unload baggage onto aircraft. So typically they have a requirement that you have to lift 50 pounds. All right. Or let's say like someone who works in a coffee shop or a little cafe, they have to be able to work with customers and work reasonably well with others. They have to communicate effectively in English, things like that. So every job has those essential things that an employee must do. Now, job descriptions are not required under the ADA, but boy, they can really, really come in handy when you're trying to defend an EEOC charge for discrimination, especially around an ADA issue here. So they can be really your best defense, but they can also be your worst nightmare if they are not done well. All right. Now, let's move on to best practice number 2. Get your job descriptions updated with ADA compliant language and be specific. So what do I mean by ADA compliant language? Well, let's examine that. Let's say we have an employee who works in a large home improvement store in the paint department. Think like a Lowe's or a Home Depot or, something like that, or a big warehouse operation. So an employee, perhaps who works in customer service in the paint department, routinely has to retrieve paint from the store shelves. Some of them are fairly high. So what if the job description said, must be able to climb a ladder to retrieve products for customers to fill orders? Well, is that really a true statement? Or does the employee in that job simply have to ascend and descend to go up to the shelves that are higher in order to retrieve the product? You see, in many of those warehouse type of environments, employees use a piece of equipment that's known as a scissor lift. It's motorized, you push a button, and then the lift is just simply a platform that would take the employee up to the shelving that they need to get to, even if it's fairly high, and then they push a button and it brings them back down to ground level. Now, if you had an employee with a disability, and let's say it was an employee with a severe physical disability, perhaps didn't have the use of his lower extremities and had to use a motorized chair. Okay, if that employee with the physical disability needed to retrieve product on the shelf, does he actually have to climb? The answer is no. If you have that scissor lift as a piece of equipment, you now are pretty rigid in the way you've described that job. Okay. Now, if you had it in your job description that climbing is required, it's an essential function, more than likely a hiring manager would have passed over this candidate with the physical disability, wouldn't it? Now, to my listening audience, this is a scenario that could get you an EEOC charge pretty darn quickly, and an EEOC charge for discriminating based on disability and a violation of the ADA. Why? Because the job really does not require climbing, but rather ascending and descending. So those are two of what I'm referring to as ADA compliant language. So the job description in and of itself is creating what's called a disparate impact on a population of individuals with disabilities and those that may have a physical disability and lack the use of their lower extremities. All right, now let's conversely look at an example where climbing is required. Let's say we have a cell tower field technician. All right, these are the techs that have to go out in sometimes austere conditions, get up on the mountaintop, and they have to definitely climb a ladder and sometimes to really great heights because they do tower construction activities like assembling or erecting towers. They install antennas, mount hardware. So this is a job that requires climbing. So if you had a candidate who came to apply for the job that did not have the ability to climb, if you declined that candidate, that would not be discriminatory. The reason is the candidate isn't qualified for the job to begin with. That would be no different than if you had a job that required being fluent in Portuguese, read, write, and speak Portuguese, and the candidate only knew a little bit of Spanish. That isn't going to work. The job requires fluency in that foreign language. So if they tried to claim that you were discriminatory, they didn't meet the qualifications for the job to begin with. All right. So this is another reason why I'm really stressing the job descriptions are absolutely essential. And this is also how you're going to use this if you are investigating. If you're going to determine whether or not you as an employer or a manager, let's say, has been discriminatory, you have to have a good, accurate job description to know what the job really does require, and then compare it to what the accommodation request is from the employer. Now, best practice number 3, you've got to get clear on what constitutes an undue hardship. And the first thing I want to share is that this is very much a case-by-case basis determination. There is not any one scenario that is reasonable or isn't reasonable. I'm often asked, I have clients who will call me and say, Natalie, here's my situation. Is this reasonable? And I'll turn it around and I'll say, okay. I said to one of my clients, I said, Alex, let's talk about it. I'm not here to tell you whether it is or it isn't, but let's walk through what you've done in the past. Let's talk about how it might impact your employees, your customers, your operations. You see, it's not a standalone request. What you may be able to grant for one employee in one department, such as perhaps you have an employee in the IT department that is requesting remote work as a result of a legitimate disability, and you grant that. That's not an undue hardship. However, if you had someone who was an operations associate that is an equipment operator and their regular predictable attendance is required, okay, then that needs to be on site. They can't do that job from home. So that's certainly unreasonable. Right. So when you're investigating allegations of discrimination, especially when the issue is surrounding an accommodation request, it's usually then when an employee is requesting something that might be a little extraordinary. All right. So as I said, you've got to look at the request and compare it to the job description. So let's say the job requires lifting 50 pounds repeatedly, such as Randy, the ramp agent we talked about, in handling baggage. If the 50 pounds is an essential job function on the ramp agent job description, You definitely would not want to grant an accommodation if Randy brought a doctor's note and his doctor said, well, Randy, you can only lift 20 pounds, and that's a permanent lifting restriction. Oh, hold on a second. Look, just because the doctor said that Randy's got a lifting restriction doesn't mean that we're going to lower the standard here and that we're going to change the job description, because if we let Randy get by with only lifting 20-pound bags, but then you try to hold another employee accountable who's not lifting 50 pounds repeatedly or not moving the bags off the aircraft quickly enough to meet performance standards, okay, how are you going to hold those employees accountable if you kind of cut Randy a little bit of slack here and lowered the standard? All right? Under the ADA, employers have no obligation to eliminate essential functions off the job description. Our obligation is to reasonably accommodate so that employees can perform the work that's required. In other words, we don't lower performance standards or ever delete essential functions to meet the disability. So what we do is accommodate to help the employee meet the essential functions and the standards. So a common problem I see when I'm consulting with organizations on this is that employers are going way, way beyond and in essence are completely changing an entire job description to meet the disability. And as I said, what this does is it changes the job description for everyone else in that job. So let that be a lesson to you. You reasonably accommodate unless it would be an undue hardship. And if you have an employee that's asking for standards to be lowered or essential functions to be deleted or to just set it aside, that's not an accommodation. That is never going to be reasonable, okay? What undue hardship means is an accommodation that would be unduly costly, extensive, substantial, or disruptive to business operations, or that would maybe fundamentally alter the nature of the way you do business. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, I remember a number of years ago, there was a technician that worked in telecom for one of the big telecom companies. And he had post-traumatic stress disorder, and he very much wanted to bring his service dog to work with him. All right, now, for those of you who know me, plenty of love for my veterans, and I've got plenty of love for dogs. I do a lot of rescue work and rescue dogs and, quite frankly, all sorts of animals. Got nothing but love for you, brother, and the fact that you want to have your dog at work. But you know what? This was in South Florida. The dog was a Belgian Malinois. They're often mistaken for German Shepherds. And yes, he did need the dog for his PTSD, and it was legitimate. He had certainly doctor's paperwork that backed that up. The problem was that his job entailed going into people's homes and businesses and doing telephone line repairs, installing internet, and he wanted the dog to accompany him on every job site. Well, that's not feasible, is it? There are many people who don't want pets in their home. They might have other pets that they're concerned about their safety, or small children. People are allergic. You can't leave the dog in the car in a subtropical climate. It just wasn't going to work. All right. And so they pushed back, and the telecom company prevailed because they stated it wasn't undue hardship. They also gave him numerous other options, but he just didn't seem to like any of those options. Okay. What happens at that point is you reach an impasse. The employer has done its level best to try to provide something that is reasonable, but it was the employee who just chose to just shut that interactive process down. All right, at that point, you've reached impasse, you put it in writing, and then if the employee just does not comply, then it may be the next step is that you're moving toward a separation of employment. Because if the employee is refusing to work without you granting that accommodation, you are at that impasse. All right, but of course, you're going to document the heck out of all of that. But I just want to point out that the accommodations we grant need to be reasonable. So generally speaking, when we're looking at an undue hardship, the courts are certainly on the employer's side when employees are also requesting extensive amounts of time off. Look, the ADA was designed as an equal employment opportunity law, not to be fashioned into another form of a law like the FMLA, Family and Medical Leave. It is not a leave law. And so thankfully, we've seen a number of court cases. One is Delgado Echevarria versus AstraZeneca Pharmaceuticals. So if you want to look that up, that's case law that is often cited in situations where employees are asking for extensive amounts of time off as an accommodation. Now, it's not to say that maybe some time off in shorter duration, maybe an employee recovering post-surgery or something like that might be reasonable. That sort of leaves the door open for that. But generally, excessive amounts of time off are going to be considered unreasonable. employees that really do have very unpredictable attendance, and let's say the job requires regular predictable attendance. Okay, if that's in the job description, now they're asking for you to edit an essential function off your job description. So I would definitely say that's not gonna happen. That would be a deal breaker. We're not going to grant that. And then also when employees are asking for things that are really unreasonable, such as requesting a different supervisor and requesting, well, I'm not going to work with this person and that person and this person and that person, and they're just not getting along, right? Most employers are going to consider that those are a hardship as well. All right, so I hope that this particular episode has given you some food for thought. All right, so remember, you got to get those job descriptions updated. You've got to have ADA compliant language, and you definitely need to make sure that you're really clear on what these things are that are undue hardships. And I would certainly recommend, before you take any specific action, perhaps to separate an employee, I would definitely run it by your legal counsel. So that's it for today. I look forward to having you back at another episode of the HR Investigations podcast. See ya.
Thanks for joining us today on the HR Investigations podcast. Be sure to subscribe, like, and share the show with any colleagues who will benefit from our strategies and solutions. For free bonus resources, simply visit hr-investigations.com. And remember, if you'd like some help with improving your investigative skills, or if your organization is in need of an external investigator to help with the case, please get in touch with us. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.